Winter of 1848, Macon. A mid-sized southern town, nestled by the Ocmulgee Rive, beathed to the rhythm of cotton, wagons, and steamboats. In the mornings, mist ascended from the warehouses, from bales stacked in pyramids, from the low oofs of workshops, where the clang of hammers and the keen wisp of saw blades a lady echoed. In the eyes of local authorities, Macon was a triumph, a burgeoning city, a railway nexus, proof of what slavery could yield when, in thy wads, well administered. This was the official version, the one that filled Epos dispatched to Atlanta and the regional newspapers. In the notaes' offices, the same native unfolded, line after relentless line. Thick, leathe-bound ledgers lay open on tables, meticulously encoding land sales, mortgages, the transfer of human property. The ink bound with age, signatures followed in succession, some elegant, some hesitant, as if the hand that signed recoiled from, acknowledging the text's stack pronouncement. Within these volumes, anti-columns we enslaved for a specific category. People of color, no faces, no histories, only fist names, approximate ages, a price. The Georgia Code, in its aid legal pose, maintained ode. It defined the enslaved as movable, property, transferable, seizable, mortgageable, faux judges, faux chefs, faux local militia offices. Everything began and ended thee, a legal framework permitting human lives to be discussed with the lexicon of commerce. In county assembly minutes, one ed phases meant to issue, tranquility eins, public ode is secured, relations between masters and servants remain harmonious. This was the image the city sought to project of itself. Beyond this facade, the lived reality was stately different. In the alleyways behind the workshops, in the cabins lining the edges of neebe plantations, hundreds of men, women, and children os before dawn. Their names would never grace the editorials of the Macon Telegraph. They appeared only, at times, in the classifieds. For sale, fugitive at large, reward offered. Violence was evanescent, diffuse, airly decided, almost always implied. It etched itself into scars, into one bodies, into the silence that fell when a foeman crossed the yard. In the archives, Macon peasanted itself as an odied city. Maps depicted it in state lines, streets carefully named, churches and courthouses marked by small, angular symbols. One could trace, on cadastral surveys, the expansion of the business district, the construction of new warehouses, the aval of railway tax. But one had to look otherwise to perceive what these documents left unsaid. Between the lines of minutes, behind the production figures, lurked the house of forced labor, the sea-pated families, the sales mentioned only by a num and a date. The winter of 1848 was not a neutral moment. The anti-nation grappled with the question of slavery's expansion into western territories. Macon's newspapers reproduced, excerpts of speeches, vigorously defended the property rights of southern masters and denounced abolitionists as dangerous agitators. Though a white, affluent Eid subscribed to these papers, the vision was clear. Slavery was an ancient, stable institution, guaranteed by the Constitution. Ray dissenting voices we ridiculed or simply ignored. In black neighborhoods, fear of enslaved, such certainty was non-existent. Insecurity was a constant companion. A whisper of a sale, a word uttered too loudly, a gaze deemed insolent could suffice to shatter a life. Families knew nothing was guaranteed. A master mired in debt could decide, within days, to sell a woman or a child to balance his accounts. In the county court records, columns listed the liquidation of inheritances, and amidst inventories of furniture, cats and cattle, one read, "Woman named, boy named." Human beings were absorbed into the cold logic of patrimony. By the riverbanks, as night fell, the city grew quiet. Shops closed, Offices emptied, notaries tidied their ledgers. In masters' homes, lamps were lit, conversations drifted to cotton prices, news from Washington, preparations for Christmas festivities. Tips, visits, receptions were planned. In the slave quarters, a quiet count was kept of the few days of respite, sometimes promised for Christmas. A little extra food, a few hours where the relentless pace of labor eased. These interstices, these minute fissures in the disciplined continuum of slavery, were observed with fervent hope. In some forgotten ledger, somewhere in Macon, a hand that year inscribed two names that now hold significance for us. They appear without emphasis, downed among others. Ellen, a young woman of fair complexion, noted as property of a white family. William, a black man, a carpenter, appraised at a higher price due to his skill. For the notary, for the owner, these were mere entries in a book, assigned a monetary value. Nothing in the script hinted that these two names would one day converge, becoming the heart of a narrative. The city itself remained oblivious. It knew nothing of the hushed conversations held in cabins at night, of the fragments of news from the north that circulated, of the murmured hymns speaking of escape, of paths, of deliverance. It knew not that the very law that claimed to be unshakable contained flaws, that distances, train schedules, the habits of white people during holidays could be observed, studied, turned against the established order. On the surface, Macon wintered in apparent tranquility, cloaked by the reassuring discourse of its elites, protected by its laws and militias. In its depths, something stirred, leaving no direct trace in the archives. Most of the lives involved would never be named. Yet, to grasp what would transpire at the close of 1848, one must commence here, in this city that thrived on slavery, amidst these heavy-paged ledgers, where the names of Ellen and William already existed, but only as lost lines in an inventory. Part 2. The Body of Ellen, Whiteness, Property, and Imposed Silence. In the archives, Ellen rarely appeared by her full name. Most often, she was but a first name, followed by a terse indication: mulatto, light-skinned, sometimes an approximate age. Succession registers, post-mortem inventory lists, bills of sale. None of these recounted the story. They merely drafted a cold equation: sex, color, dollar valuation. To comprehend what her body signified within Georgia's slave society, one must read not only what was written, but also what was meticulously silenced, what the ink never dared to articulate. Ellen was born around 1826, into a household where the boundary between the white family and the enslaved was already blurred. Her probable father was her mother's master, a respected white man, a property owner, a citizen. Her mother, however, existed in documents only as an enslaved black woman without further status. State law was unequivocal. The child followed the condition of the mother. It mattered not the father's blood, nor that he was also the one signing deeds, voting, perhaps serving on juries. In the eyes of the law, Ellen was enslaved from her very first breath. This rule, inherited from the principle of partus sequitur ventrem, functioned as a machine for easing responsibility. It allowed for the legalization of a situation that, otherwise, would pose an unbearable question: how could a free man sell his own daughter? The law responded by denying her. It saw no daughter. It saw the offspring of an enslaved woman, and classified this offspring as property. Thus, the white father could bequeath her, gift her, sell her, without even having to acknowledge anything beyond an economic interest. Yet, Ellen's body unsettled this arrangement. Very early, her light skin drew attention. Her face, her hair, her features aligned her with the master's legitimate children. Within the house, this resemblance was both visible and unspeakable. One divined, without uttering it, that blood ties traversed the kitchen and the parlor, the yard and the dining room. The white children grew up knowing, in a confused way, that certain black women in the house held a particular status, that they were spoken of in hushed tones. The enslaved children, meanwhile, understood very early that color could be a trap, that it offered no protection from sale, that it granted no rights. In the documents, the situation was settled by technical vocabulary. When Ellen was given as a wedding gift to one of her master's white daughters, the deed expressed nothing of the intimate history this gesture encompassed. It merely enumerated a certain mulatto girl named Ellen, aged approximately. This transfer for the notary was but one clause among others in a family contract. For Ellen, it was a total displacement, an uprooting from her mother, a change of home, a new master. The decision was endorsed by a pen in the quiet of an office. It would translate into silent T's somewhere behind a service door. Ellen's body thus became a train of contradictions. It bore the visible mark of miscegenation, of the sexual violence structuring slave society, while simultaneously being used as a symbol of prestige for the family who owned her. To have light-skinned servants in the house was, for some masters, a refined symbol, almost a staging of their power. The young woman's body was both instrumentalized and watched. Perhaps she was placed indoors, near the children, near the white mistress, and yet a quiet vigilance was kept over her, as if her resemblance to white people could at any moment transform into a threat. Within this arrangement, Ellen possessed no public voice. She could not read, no write. Her testimony held no legal weight. She could not testify against a white person. If she spoke, she could be punished, corrected, sold. When one sought her existence in the archives, it was found indirectly in the accounts of others, in a book published much later under her husband's name, or in the surprised notes of white visitors who, in passing, remarked upon this almost white negress serving at table. Her direct voice was absent. Her silence, this imposed silence, became a central part of her record. One must imagine Ellen's ordinary days in those years. Her hands at work, her lean gestures for serving, sewing, tidying, maintaining the house, her controlled movements, her watched relationships, her overhead conversations. Before the masters, she had to stand straight, answer respectfully, avoid any sign of defiance. In the rare moments she could be among other enslaved people, she heard stories of sales, separations, sometimes of escapes, but she also knew that they spoke of her color, of the possibility that one day a creditor, an heir, might decide to turn her into currency. In the symbolic universe of the antebellum South, whiteness was synonymous with freedom, power, respectability. Ellen's body breached this code without shattering it. From a distance, she sometimes passed for a free person. On certain occasions, if well-dressed, if she walked quickly, head covered, a passerby would not guess she was not white. Yet, this misunderstanding was fragile. It took only a word, an order shouted by a foreman, a reminder to her place for social truth to assert itself. This ambiguity would later be at the heart of their escape plan, but in 1848 it was primarily a source of permanent tension. Ellen lived with the keen awareness that her appearance opened possibilities while keeping her prison of a status she had not chosen. This paradox was inscribed even in her flesh. Daughter of a man who would never acknowledge her, sister of young white people who would have access to schooling, property, the vote, while she did not even own her own body. Macon's newspapers at the time mentioned this type of situation only in the form of hushed scandals when a matter erupted too openly. They published editorials on the duties of masters, on the paternalistic benevolence that should be shown to the enslaved. Never did they describe, with precision, what it meant for a young woman like Ellen to be both a master's child and an object in his inventory. The social order rested on this double blindness: private recognition, public denial. When later, years after the escape, Ellen's life was accounted in lectures, in books. Emphasis was often placed on the ingenuity of the disguise, on the courage, on the audacity. But behind that spectacular scene lay a stark truth. If she was able to pass as a white man, it was because her entire existence had been marked by that original violence, which made her both visible and invisible. Visible as a desirable body, invisible as a person. As the winter of 1848 began, as Macon prepared for Christmas, Ellen's file, on paper, was simple. She was listed as family property, integrated into a dowry or a contract, valued, classified. No marginal note indicated what she felt, what she feared, what she hoped. Yet it was from this body, from this skin too fair for slavery, but too marked for freedom, that an unthinkable project would be born. What the registers reduced to a line would soon stand, for a few days, against the entire legal edifice that claimed to contain it. Part 3. William Craft, hired worker, watched husband. In Macon's records, William appeared first as a boy, then as a skilled man. Where others were described merely as field hands, he was often qualified as apprentice, carpenter, or joiner. This slight precision in the writing was not a gesture of recognition, but a mark of market value. A skilled enslaved person brought a higher return. In the contracts where his name appeared, there was no mention of his family, his ties, his fears. The discourse was of output, mental duration, sums owed to his owner. The system in which William was entangled was that of hiring out, the leasing of enslaved labor. His master, instead of employing him personally, rented him to a workshop, an entrepreneur, sometimes a construction company. A typical document, drafted on yellowed paper, enumerated the obligations of each party. The white employer would pay a predetermined sum to the owner at the end of the month. He would provide work clothes, a certain number of meals. He would have the right to correct the enslaved person as needed. At the bottom of the page, a signature, never Williams. Officially, this system was presented in Southern newspapers as proof of slavery's flexibility. It was explained that talented enslaved people could thus develop skills, that some masters, out of kindness, even allowed their enslaved to keep a small portion of their wages. Local authorities' reports lauded the prosperity of workshops employing these hired men, extolling the growth of the construction sector. In this public narrative, everyone supposedly benefited. The master, the employer, the city. William's lived reality was quite different. Hired did not mean free, but displaced. Each change of employer brought a new dependency, a new scrutiny, a new potential for violence. In the workshop where he toiled, he was subject to the master's discipline, the foreman's orders, while simultaneously exposed to the whim of an owner he sometimes saw rarely, but whose decision could, at any moment, send him back to the fields, sell him, or move him to another state. Between these two powers, his margin for action was minuscule. Yet it was in this narrow space that William learned to observe. He watched white men sign contracts, fill out receipts, tally houses, weigh timbers, discuss building sites. He observed the routes taken by cats, the schedules of freight trains, the comings and goings between Macon and neighboring towns. He understood that time was not merely the chime of the bell dictating work, but that of connections, tickets, passes. In his mind, though no document attested to it, a mental map of the city and its possible exits gradually formed. The papers that spoke of him retained none of this slow acquisition of knowledge. They encoded only sums due, days absent, any infractions. A master's report might, for instance, note that a certain William was caught speaking too long with another slave, or that he showed reluctance to obey an order. Behind these dry lines, one must imagine the warnings, the blows, the threats of sale. Each disciplinary notation in a ledger was the visible tip of a permanent climate of fear. It was in the city that William met Ellen. In the archives, nothing indicated the precise moment their paths converged. What is known comes from their late accounts. Two lives caught in different households, under different labor regimes, but subject to the same logic of ownership. Their marriage was not a civil act. It held no official record. Perhaps a black pastor, authorized by a master, uttered a few words in a cabin or a secluded corner of a yard. Perhaps they simply exchanged vows, before God, but not before the law. For the slave system, this marriage did not exist. Georgia law did not recognize the union of enslaved people as a legally binding contract. Masters might encourage it, even organize it, to serve the stability of their plantations, but they could also shatter it without recourse. In inventories one sometimes read, man, about 25, good carpenter. Further on, woman, about 22, domestic, good seamstress. From testimonies, we know these were husband and wife. The registers, however, separated them into different columns with no apparent link. It was in this disparity that another form of tension arose. William knew that his marriage to Ellen offered no protection against sale. He knew that if Ellen's master or his own decided to balance a debt, they could, overnight, be sent in opposite directions to different buyers, perhaps to distant states. Separated couples, children torn from parents, were not exceptions. They were common practice, barely noted in auction minutes. This constant threat was ingrained in their daily lives. The rare accounts we have of William emphasize a weighty decision for him and Ellen not to have children as long as they remained enslaved. They knew that any birth would immediately be seized by law, classified as property of Ellen's master. To refuse procreation under these conditions was an attempt to withhold from the system what it expected of them, a new generation of bodies to exploit. It was an intimate act of resistance, but one accompanied by deep pain, a renunciation that left no trace in official archives. Over the years, William became a valuable woke to those who exploited him. His skill in woking wood, in epaying, in building, increased his maquette value. In documents, this translated into a high figu, into flatting mentions of his usefulness. In his ill life, it meant increased control. His movements we watched more closely. His potential sale discussed with G8 gravity, calculations made of what he might fetch in a nothy state if cotton prices fluctuated. The more valuable he became, the chain that bound him. Local newspapers sometimes spoke of skilled black laborers. They mentioned them to highlight the city's prosperity, to show that slavery could be, in their view, civilizing. They said nothing of the stolen house, the diverted wages, the humiliations endured. Nor did they speak of the quiet contemplation occurring in the mind of a man like William. By dint of delivering planks, traveling to stations, docks, construction sites, he accumulated scraps of information, Taindapatu times, how agents checked tickets, the habits of white taveles with the savants. In the sessi of the Union, William and Ellen transformed these fragments into a shade deflection. In the evenings, when work was finally done, they shade what they had seen, what they had heard. Ellen recounted conversations in the house, the masts chismas tavel plans, let's received invitations. William reported schedules, outes, umos circulating among wokes and hide enslaved people. None of this would eve be coded in a ledge, but it was in these wisped exchanges that the future escape plan found its initial form. At this precise moment, in the winter of 1848, the papers concerning William gave no hint of what was brewing. They continued to assign him to his place as a hide woke, to quantify his time, to settle accounts between white men. His status as a husband did not exist. His fear of separation, his silent age, his refusal to accept this life as his only horizon, remained off record. Yet, behind each column of figures, behind each mention of 1 year's lease, stood a man, observing, calculating, waiting. A man who knew that, to beak the ode cushing him, he would have to use what the system had taught him, its outs, its schedules, its papes. A watched husband, but a leady, without the archives being able to note it, a fugitive in the making. Partie 4. Imagining the escape. When the plan is born in shadow, nothing in the papers of Winty 1848 hinted that an extraordinary project was taking shape. Macon's Aegistes mentioned the same entities as previous years: cotton sales, land auctions, disputes between owns. Local newspapers announced church services, commodity avals, Christmas holiday preparations. In this official version, the city-based foe a few days of Evely. Families united, masses, visits, stoles. The slave system presented itself as stable, self-assured, easy to celebrate its own prosperity. For Ellen and William, these same days held an entirely different meaning. Christmas, in the lives of the enslaved, was an ambivalent period. On one hand, it was sometimes a time when masters slightly relaxed discipline, offered a little extra food, allowed some est. On the other, it was also the season for sales and displacements. Family gatherings we exploited to settle inheritances, distribute property, send this that enslaved person to a new mast. Beneath the veneer of festivities, fear circulated. For years, in the black quarters, stories had been passed down about what lay beyond Georgia. Whispers spoke of towns where slavery did not exist, of different laws, of organized free communities. Information arrived in fragments: a peddler who had traveled, a sailor recounting tales of the North, an abolitionist newspaper discreetly received by a free black person and read aloud. William sometimes caught snippets of these narratives in workshops. Ellen, in the house, overheard fragments of conversations among masters, frightened by the agitations in certain northern states. Traditionally, masters liked to present themselves as protectors. In their correspondence, in the sermons they delivered at church, they described slavery as a paternalistic relationship. They spoke of their people as an extended family, whom they fed, housed, and supervised. But Ellen and William knew the reality. No protection shielded them from a decision made over their heads, from a morning when it would be announced that a group would depart for another plantation, another state. The facade of benevolence cracked each time a bond was broken without explanation. It was in this perpetual tension that the idea of escape, long unthinkable, began to take a more precise form. William, who had observed roads, trains, and schedules for years, knew that leaving Georgia on foot, heading north, would be an almost impossible journey. Patrols stood guard. Posters described fugitives. Bounties awaited their captors. The territory was monitored, girded. Anyone embarking openly exposed themselves to a chase that could last weeks. Yet, another form of evasion existed, less visible in the stories told in the evenings, one that involved traversing slave territory in plain sight, using the master's modes of transport. Trains, steamboats, hotels were not designed for fugitives. They were organized for white people, for men of fortune traveling with their servants. But it was precisely there, in this social given, that a flaw lay hidden. Slave society was so certain of its hierarchies that it only envisioned certain types of travelers, certain types of bodies in certain places. Ellen and William began to gauge the magnitude of this flaw. They noticed that white people traveling with enslaved individuals followed repetitive habits. The master settled into the best seats. The servant handled luggage, responded to requests. No one questioned this staging, because it confirmed the established order. On tickets, in hotel registers, on passenger lists, enslaved people were often unnamed. They were referred to as servant, boy. The essential thing for the companies was to know the name of the paying master. The rest were anonymous silhouettes. In their evening conversations, Ellen and William pondered, What would happen if this role of master were assumed not by a legitimate white person, but by someone who resembled them enough to deceive the hurried gaze of agents? Ellen knew that her light skin, which had drawn particular attention since childhood, could be a constant danger. But perhaps it could, for a few days, become a weapon. The idea was both simple and dizzying: to slip into the costume, literally and figuratively, of those who owned them. This reversal was not immediately obvious. It clashed with everything they had been taught since childhood. The entire society reiterated that a black woman, even one with a very light complexion, must remain in her place, that the slightest deviation would be punished. To see oneself, even for an instant, in the role of a free white man, an owner, was unimaginable. Yet it was precisely because it was unimaginable for the masters that the plan could succeed. If no one conceived that such an invasion was possible, no one would look for it. The sources we possess today evoke this moment with hindsight. In their narrative, published much later, Ellen and William recounted how they, together, conceived this strategy. They were not professional strategists, no seasoned conspirators. They were a couple under extreme pressure, seeking an escape where the system claimed none existed. Their plan emerged from the confluence of three elements: the Christmas period, which multiplied masters' travels, William's experience with routes and schedules, and the singularity of Ellen's body, simultaneously a mark of suffered oppression and the key to a possible use. But more intimate considerations lent this project its decisive strength. Ellen and William knew that time was against them. Each passing year increased the risk of a sale, an inheritance, a separation. Each rumor of a raid against enslaved people, suspected of planning escape, reiterated that the order was tightening its grip. They lived with the acute awareness that it was not enough to dream of another life. One had to, at some point, accept to wager everything that remained. Escape was not a romantic gesture. It was a desperate gamble against the inevitable. At night, in their cabins, the sounds of the plantation or the city softened. One could still hear, in the distance, a dog, a cat, a late song. The masters slept, reassured by the code, by the patrols, by the conviction that the enslaved possessed neither the means nor the audacity to defy them directly. It was in these silent hours that Ellen and William fine-tuned their project. They had no detailed maps, no calendar, no in-depth knowledge of northern laws. They had only what they had seen, what they had heard, what they could deduce. The initial idea was still vague. Depart during the Christmas period, take advantage of passes that were easy to obtain, use the train to quickly cover long distances. Then, gradually, a structure emerged. Ellen would have to appear as a person authorized to travel far, with a domestic. Her etiquette would need explanation, care taken to avoid too many signature requests, her silence justified. William would have to maintain a position of apparent subordination, while watching over her at every step, remaining vigilant for the slightest signs of suspicion. None of this was recorded in any contemporary document. Macon's official archives retain no trace of these discussions. They saw only another winter, balanced accounts, holidays to prepare. But already, in the lived reality of Ellen and William, laws, travel customs, and racial prejudices were discreetly transformed into materials for a survival project. The very system that claimed to crush them unwittingly provided the elements of their plan. As Christmas 1848 approached, the public record remained unchanged. Ellen was still listed as a domestic, William as a hired worker. No judge, no notary, no owner imagined that two of these lines, lost in the multitude, were about to intertwine to defy the entire code. In the shadow, however, the decision was made. It was no longer merely about imagining escape as a distant possibility, but about organizing it, dating it, making it real. The next step would be to materialize this wild idea, with the very substances the system provided: a costume, papers, tickets. In other words, to fabricate a white master from the body of a black woman whom the law saw only as property. Part 5. Fabricating a white master: costume, illness, and papers. At the heart of the plan envisioned by Ellen and William lay an operation both material and symbolic, to transform for a few days an enslaved black woman into a free white man, proprietor of a servant. This project was not merely a matter of clothing, it was a complete theatrical staging, conceived to deceive eyes, customs, and the law itself. In a society where color, gender, and status were meant to be immediately legible, attempting such a metamorphosis meant gambling with all codes simultaneously. The first question was that of costume. William knew, from observation, how masters who frequented the workshop, those who travelled, those who signed contracts, carried themselves, dressed, and walked. He had seen well-tailored coats, broad-brimmed hats, scarves, waistcoats, canes. He had noticed how certain older men, sickly or fatigued, settled into the best seats, let others speak for them, signed in haste. These silhouettes became, in his mind, a model to emulate. But for Ellen, the difficulty was twofold. It was not merely about replicating these outward signs. She also had to mask what her body might betray: her female voice, her gestures, her hands, her lack of a beard, all risked arousing questions. Consequently, the plan incorporated an additional element: illness. If the faux master appeared as a suffering, diminished, partially incapacitated man, it would be easier to explain a weak voice, prolonged silence, a reluctance to reveal too much of himself. The staging of fragility became a shield. Later, accounts precisely described the imagined artifices. An arm in a sling, tightly bandaged, justified Ellen's inability to write or sign with ease. Dark spectacles at times concealed her gaze. A scarf, a raised collar, limited what was visible of her face. One might even suppose the use of an additional bandage, or a scarf, wrapped to maximally obscure the line of her neck and the delicacy of her features. Each piece of fabric was chosen, adjusted, not to elude, but to protect. In the house where Ellen served, these preparations had to be made in silence, in fragments, without arousing suspicion. A borrowed coat, secretly purchased, or acquired second-hand, a hat of better quality than she usually wore, gloves to conceal the slenderness of her hands. None of this could appear abruptly. Each element had to be justifiable in the master's eyes, should they notice it before departure. An announced visit, a service to end, an end to complete might serve as a pretext for temporarily being entrusted with an item of clothing. The rest would have to be purchased with the money patiently set aside by William. Money, precisely, was an essential datum of the endeavor. Officially, an enslaved person owned no property. Everything they earned belonged, by right, to the master. In practice, some masters overlooked small savings, tips, or overtime paid in kind or cash. William had exploited these fissures to accumulate a modest sum, hidden, entrusted to trusted relatives. It was with this fragile capital, the fruit of years of privation, that they had to finance tickets, clothes, and everything that would allow them to evade the authorities' attention. The question of papers remained. In a society obsessed with certificates, passes, and signatures, a journey without documents would be an immediate admission of clandestine status. A white person could sometimes circulate with fewer questions, a black person never. For their scenario to succeed, the faux master needed plausible papers, and the servant needed to present himself as an enslaved person traveling with his owner's authorization. The use consisted of superimposing these two dimensions. For William, it was possible to obtain a pass, at least locally. Masters sometimes issued their enslaved people a note attesting their authorization to travel for a specific task, for a limited duration. This type of document, poorly controlled, could serve as a starting point. For Ellen, however, there was no official form of paper that recognized her as a legal subject. This is where the disguise and the illness came into play. If the person clothed was identified as a white man, if he was presumed to be a master, society would not demand the same proofs. One element of the plan was particularly revealing of its fragile position. Ellen would not know how to sign. As an enslaved person, she had never received instruction. Reading and writing were forbidden to her. Yet, the figure of the literate white property owner was, in the Southern imagination, almost automatic. To reconcile these contradictions, the couple conceived of an additional handicap. The faux master would be not only ill but partially incapacitated, perhaps afflicted by an injury that made writing painful, even impossible. If a signature was demanded, it would be possible to invoke suffering, fatigue, the necessity of haste. Voice also posed a problem. An accent, a choice of words, a tone of phrase could betray what skin color concealed. Ellen would have to speak as little as possible, content herself with nods, whispers, gestures. William, officially her servant, would in fact become the one who managed the most practical interactions, carrying luggage, responding to minor inquiries, relaying messages. Ellen's role would be to maintain the posture, to silently embody the presumed authority of the master, leaving to others, as much as possible, the task of speaking in her stead. On a symbolic level, this reversal was dizzying. Everything that, in the slave order, manifested the power of white people over black people had to be seized, inverted, appropriated. The coat, the hat, the cane, the first-class cabin, the ticket purchased at the counter, the glance of the official who first addressed the white person, all of this became, for a few days, a tool for survival. Yet, neither Ellen nor William could afford to rejoice in this momentary reprieve. They knew that this power was merely a mask, ready to shatter at the slightest suspicion. In the archives, this fabrication work left almost no trace. Commercial registers did not note an enslaved person's purchase of a coat. Notaries did not record the preparation of a sling or a pair of spectacles. What we know of it comes from what would be recounted later, in another time, in other countries, when the escape had become an example cited in abolitionist circles. But at the moment these decisions were made, in Macon, they remained confined to the most intimate sphere, the most restricted circle of trust. One can imagine the scene not as a spectacular episode, but as a succession of precise, restrained gestures. William discreetly tying a hat on Ellen's head in a corner where no one could see them. Ellen adjusting a scarf before a polished piece of metal serving as a mirror, seeking a way to hide her features without appearing suspicious. Scraps of fabric transformed into a bandage, an arm kept in a sling to test possible movements under this constraint. Nothing appeared entirely natural. Everything had to seem sufficiently credible in the eyes of those who, by habit, did not truly look. Throughout this preparation, one element remained central: fear. Each object obtained, each piece of clothing acquired, each failed attempt was accompanied by the risk of being surprised, questioned, punished. Ellen and William were not actors rehearsing a role for a benevolent audience. They were captives practicing defiance against a system that, if it caught them, would grant them no second chance. Their apparent calm concealed extreme tension, a constant calculation of danger. By the end of this phase, the plan had taken concrete form. Ellen had a costume of a sick white master, coherent enough to withstand superficial examination. William had the more customary role of an attentive black servant, carrying luggage and tickets. They had identified train schedules, understood necessary connections, prepared a minimal story in case of questions. A Southern proprietor traveling north for medical treatment, accompanied by a single servant. The official version of this journey was ready, tightly constructed, simplified to the extreme to avoid contradictions. Nothing, however, guaranteed this edifice would hold. The laws remained the same, as did the prejudices. Patrols existed. Railway agents had their rules. Owners had the right, by law, to reclaim their property wherever they found it. Ellen and William's plan did not abolish this order. It merely sought to slip through its meshes, to exploit its rigidity, to pass quickly, without allowing the system time to comprehend what lay before its eyes. The date was finally set, late December 1848, just before Christmas. Masters were absorbed by their own preparations, their visiting plans, their year-end accounts. In the registers there was nothing special on this page of the calendar. For Ellen and William, conversely, everything converged on those days. The costume was ready, the fictitious illness decided, the papers obtained or prepared as much as possible. All that remained was to cross the threshold of the city. The next step would be written no longer in secret in the dimness of a cabin, but in the harsh light of a railway station. To leave Macon without disappearing from the registers while escaping the condition they imposed. Part 6, December 21, 1848, leaving Macon without vanishing from the registers. On December 21, 1848, in the archives of Macon, this day appeared much like any other. Commercial account books listed payments, cotton deliveries, outstanding settlements, railway company registers, encoded scheduled departures, timetables, sometimes the names of the most notable passengers. For the city, it was but one more day in the routine of a winter animated by Christmas preparations. Nothing in these documents hinted at an exceptional event unfolding. For Ellen and William, conversely, the date was etched as a milestone. The plan, long imagined, patiently prepared, had to materialize in a matter of hours. They knew they had no margin for error. Should anything fail that day, the mere attempt to depart could cost them imprisonment, lashings, or sale to distant lands. Their entire existence condensed into the narrow space between dawn and the train's departure. The official version of that morning, if one adhered strictly to the papers, was simple. A sick gentleman, travelling with his servant, was headed toward the coast. He was, it was said, seeking a more favourable climate or boarding a ship to journey further north. At the station, employees saw what they were accustomed to seeing: hurried white men, families dispatching sons or sons-in-law, domestics carrying luggage. The ticket register, if we could consult it, would likely show only one name, that of the supposed master. Alongside, in the margin, servant would have been noted. In reality, this master had owned but one thing: his fear. Beneath the coat, behind the bandages, it was Ellen's body that stood there, sustained by the resolve not to tremble. The arm in a sling, the spectacles, the scarf, all were in place. His gestures had been rehearsed, as much as possible, in secret. His role that morning was twofold: to appear fragile enough to warrant no disturbance, yet self-assured enough that his status would not be questioned. William, for his part, arrived at the station in the position expected of him. He carried the luggage, managed the tickets, responded to minor requests. In the eyes of others, he was merely an enslaved person travelling, a familiar figure in that social landscape. Yet it was he who, in silence, observed everything: the glances of the employees, the demeanour of other travellers, the slightest detail incongruous with their anticipation. He had to appear humble and submissive while remaining ready to react to any incident. The most dangerous moment of that morning perhaps lasted only a few seconds, yet it concentrated the weight of a lifetime. According to their own account, a white man who knew William, one of those who had seen him work in town, noticed him on the platform. This man knew he was enslaved, knew to whom he belonged, recognized him in his true social status. To see him there, in apparent service to a master he did not recognize, in the context of departure for a long journey, sparked a moment of disquiet. In the papers, nothing recorded this hesitation. No report noted William's acting heart, the tension that coursed through Ellen, frozen in her role. The man stepped forward, questioning with his gaze, perhaps posing a question, asking where they were bound. The couple's destiny then hinged on trifles: the credibility of the costume, the coherence of the cover, but also the intellectual indolence of a system that struggled to conceive that enslaved people could devise such an audacious use. What the eye saw, prejudice corrected, a sick master and his domestic, that was all. The doubt dissipated. Tickets were checked, punched. This gesture, pure routine for the station employee, held immense symbolic significance. For the first time, Ellen and William crossed a barrier reserved for white people, not by breaking it, but by flowing into the fiction it protected. The ticket counter, the hand that took the money, the stamp that validated the ticket, all participated in the same logic, making visible the rights of some, rendering invisible the lack of rights of others. That morning, though an impossible sequence of events, this logic momentarily turned upon itself. In the railway company's internal registers, it is possible that the number of passengers, the day's revenue, the train's destination might have been recorded. Perhaps even a summary list of first-class travellers was kept for a time. If the name inscribed was that of a fictitious proprietor, it nonetheless left a mark on paper, confirming Ellen's passage under an identity not her own. She had never possessed a birth certificate, never a document attesting her freedom. This falsely attributed ticket was one of the rare papers that concretely opened a door for her. Upon leaving Macon by rail, Ellen and William did not immediately vanish from the city's registers. Their absence, initially, was an ordinary absence. Ellen was supposed to be in service to her mistress. William, assigned to his duties as a hired labourer. For a few days, perhaps a few weeks, some might assume a simple leave, a temporary absence. It was only as time stretched, as tasks remained vacant, that the question arose: where were they? It was then that another form of writing intervened: the runaway advertisement. When a master understood that an enslaved person would not return, he could visit a printer, dictate a description, set a reward. Newspapers published these notices in dedicated columns: runaway slave, apprehended, wanted. The language was codified, almost mechanical. Size, color, potential scars, supposed character traits were described. The human being was reduced to a combination of physical signs and market value. Ellen and William knew this moment would come. At the precise instant they boarded the train, they were not merely fleeing a place, they were escaping a social inscription that would immediately reclassify them as stolen. The law pursued them, even as they rapidly distanced themselves. In the eyes of the code, they ceased to be docile, enslaved people to become, by a simple act of unauthorized movement, criminals. From that moment, every office, every slave catcher, every citizen convinced of defending order could feel invested with a right of pursuit. For now, however, the pursuit had not begun. On December 21, at the time of departure, there were neither posters nor public announcements. The file existed only in their minds, in their tense bodies, in the costume that clung to their skin. It was a moment of silent tipping point. On one side of the station, they were still, officially, their master's property. On the other, as soon as the train began to move, they would enter a space where every mile covered would be a step further beyond the immediate reach of those who owned them. Throughout that morning, the city continued its ordinary life. Bells chimed, shops opened, children spoke of hoped-for gifts, notaries prepared year-end deeds. In an office, somewhere, the registers containing Ellen and William's names rested on a shelf, closed, their ink already dry. No one yet knew that these lines, so tranquilly traced, had just lost their grip on reality. The moral tension of this day lay in this discrepancy. On one hand, the administrative machinery of the South continued to function as if nothing had happened, confident in its grasp, in its laws. On the other, a couple, unnamed, unprotected, attempted to physically break this hold by using the very tools of the slave order, the ticket, the railway car, the hierarchy of places. There was no proclamation, no visible heroic gesture. There was a well-buttoned coat, a well-adjusted hat, a servant who lowered his eyes, a master who feigned fatigue. Later, when the alarm was raised, when the masters understood they would not return, other pages would be added to the file, letters sent to acquaintances in other states, legal proceedings with lawyers, perhaps appeals to authorities to attempt their recovery. These documents would bear the mark of indignation, of violated right, of lost property. They would narrate the escape from the perspective of those who saw it primarily as financial and moral prejudice. The official version would speak of theft, betrayal, ingratitude. The lived reality, that December 21, was of another nature. Ellen and William stole nothing but that which had always been denied them: the disposition of their own bodies, the mastery of their movements, the right not to be sold. They did not betray a benevolent protection, but a system that, from the outset, had recognized them only as mobile capital. They did not leave an extended family, as masters liked to claim, but an enterprise of domination that had made their emotional ties interchangeable pieces of an inheritance. When the train departed, Macon receded, slowly at first, then faster. There is no sonic trace of this moment in the archives, no written phrase that recounts it. We know it only through their memory, told later, when they were finally in relative safety, far from the South. Yet, to understand all that followed, one must take this silent departure seriously. It marked the first, incredibly fragile, victory of their plan. They had crossed the threshold of the station, paid for a ticket, taken their place in a system that had not been designed for them. From that point, every station, every inspection, every glance would be a new test of this fiction. December 21, 1848, was not just the day they left Macon. It was the day they accepted that their lives depended, at every instant, on others' ability to see without truly looking. The city behind them, the registers in which their names remained inscribed, did not disappear. They continued to exist, to fuel the master's anger, to found future efforts to capture them. But the train was already rolling toward another world, where the separation of castes, the racial geography of seats and compartments, would put their use to the test. It is this journey between Macon and Savannah that the rest of their story would illuminate. Part 7. Segregated carriages, insistent gazes, the journey to Savannah. The train that departed Macon on December 21, 1848, was not merely a mode of transportation. It was a social machine that ordered bodies as much as places. In the internal regulations of Southern railway companies, distinctions were not always theorized in lengthy texts, but they were enforced with implacable equality. White passengers on one side, black passengers on the other, paying travelers in the center, domestics on the margins. Printed schedules, neatly aligned on sheets distributed to the public, revealed nothing of this racial geography. Only testimonies, accounts, and customs outlined its contours. Within this arrangement, Ellen's role, disguised as a sick white master, was to blend into the compartment reserved for first-class travelers. She took her seat, her body held in a studied posture, stiff enough to suggest pain, yet assured enough to command distance. Her arms still bandaged, her clothes adjusted, she settled where, under normal circumstances, she would not even have been permitted to set foot. Around her, white men discussed cotton, stock market prices, political news. Perhaps they mentioned, in passing, the tensions surrounding slavery in the northern states. William, meanwhile, had no access to this compartment. For him, the natural place, within this order, was the carriage reserved for enslaved people, for domestics, for those whom the company considered mere appendages to their master's journey. In some trains, these carriages were at the rear, exposed to smoke and dust. In others, they were simply separated by a partition, a door, a corridor. In any case, the separation was stark. Agents enforced it without needing to justify it. It was considered self-evident. Regulations, when they mentioned these provisions, did so in vague terms: propriety, order, sometimes safety. But the true function of this social architecture was clear: to remind everyone of their place, to prevent contacts deemed undesirable, to maintain for white people a space of comfort where black presence remained confined to the margins. For Ellen and William, this organization constituted both a danger and a protection. Danger, because the distance separating them made communication difficult. Protection, because a black servant seen too often in close proximity to his sick master might attract more attention. In this first leg of the journey to Savannah, time stretched. Every stop, every slowdown of the train was a source of anguish. At each station, agents boarded, disembarked, checked tickets, observed travelers. Domestics were sometimes asked for whom they worked, where they were going. The questions were not always formulated with suspicion. They were part of a mundane ritual by which the social order reassured itself of its own solidity. William had to answer without hesitation: name the fictitious master, give the announced destination, repeat the agreed-upon story. In the archives, it is possible that the passages through these stations were recorded by terse notations. Train from Macon, arrived at such and such a time, departing for Savannah. None of these lines indicate the lingering gazes, the questions that brushed over Ellen's bandaged body, over William's silhouette. Yet it was there that a part of their survival unfolded, in the interval between what employees thought they saw and what actually stood before them. As long as this distance persisted, as long as prejudice filled the gaps, the disguise held. In the white compartment, Ellen's presence did not go entirely unnoticed. A traveller might express surprise at the apparent youth of such a suffering master. Another might politely offer to write in his stead, to sign a document if necessary. Such offers, if they occurred, were both dangerous and revealing. Dangerous because they risked forcing Ellen out of the minimal, silent role she had assigned herself. Revealing because they confirmed one thing: no one envisioned that she could be anything other than what she claimed. The idea that an enslaved black woman could occupy that seat, dressed in those clothes, did not enter the mental horizon of the other passengers. In the carriage, for enslaved people and domestics, where William stood, another form of tension reigned. The men and women who occupied it knew that their slightest movements were monitored. Some were traveling for a few days with their masters, others were being sent to new owners. Still, others accompanied white children on journeys. They spoke softly, exchanged news, compared the harshness of plantations, the temperaments of masters. William, accustomed to such conversations, had to guard against saying too much. He carried within him a secret that, if discovered by an ill-intentioned fellow traveller, would seal their doom. One must imagine these houses as a double confinement. Ellen, in first class, was trapped in a role that was not hers, a prison of clothes that, should they slip or loosen, would reveal what she was in the eyes of the law. She had to control her voice, her gestures, even her breathing, so as not to arouse excessive curiosity. William, in the black carriage, was confined in another type of role, one society forcibly assigned him, but which he now had to play even more convincingly to protect the elaborate fiction. Each of them, separated from the other, held one end of the rope that bound them. The railway company documents, if preserved, might tell us of incidents that occurred that day. A delay, a technical problem, a missed connection. They would not mention what, for Ellen and William, constituted moments of abyss. For example, a particularly scrupulous agent insisting on rechecking tickets, a talkative passenger attempting to strike up a conversation, a child staring fixedly at the bandage, intrigued. Every interaction was a test, every phase an ordeal to overcome without deviation. As the train approached Savannah, the question of what came next grew more pressing. Leaving Macon was a first step, heavy with symbolism. But as long as they remained within Georgia, they were still in territory familiar to their masters, surrounded by legal men who shared the same mental framework. Savannah, a port city, was both an extension of this world and an opening to another. It was there that steamboats departed for Charleston, then Wilmington. It was also a transit point for cargoes of enslaved people, merchandise, and news. For Ellen and William, the approach to Savannah signified the prospect of a new type of control. In ports, formalities were often strict. Authorities monitored the movements of people and goods, especially those who might leave the territory by sea. The train was not yet carrying them to a free state, but to a nexus of traffic where the density of official gazes increased. They had to present themselves with the same story, the same roles, but this time before employees accustomed to checking the papers of those boarding ships. The segregation of carriages then took on an added dimension. While Ellen would be expected in the spaces reserved for white passengers, William would have to navigate service areas, handling zones, and domestic transit points. They would not have the luxury of freely consulting, of correcting a detail of the plan, of readjusting an answer. What they had devised before leaving Macon now had to function without modification, carried by the internal discipline they had imposed upon themselves. If one searched the documentation of the era for traces of this journey to Savannah, one would primarily find figures: number of passengers, tons of goods transported, daily revenues. Merchants' correspondence would mention the reliability or delays of the service. White travelers' accounts would sometimes describe the comfort of the carriages, the landscapes traversed, the monotony of the journeys. Nothing would suggest that, among them, were two individuals for whom every jolt of the train was felt as a question. How long would the disguise hold? The moral tension of this journey to Savannah lay precisely in this invisibility. Ellen and William jeopardized the slave order, not through open revolt, but by exploiting its deliberate blindness. The train, with its segregated carriages, tickets, and compartments, was a materialization of the system. It distributed bodies, allocated privileges, organized silences. By taking their place under false identities, they did not destroy this structure, but they demonstrated that it rested, in the final analysis, on a belief that no enslaved person would ever dare to do what they were doing. When the train finally slowed in sight of Savannah, the day may have been drawing to a close or another beginning. The exact times mattered less than this observation. They had crossed, undetected, the first major stage of their itinerary. Behind them, Macon still existed, with its registers, its masters, its laws. Before them, the port of Savannah opened, with its docks, its ships, its hotels, its offices. What awaited them would be no less dangerous, but they now had proof that something the slave order deemed impossible had just occurred. A black woman had traveled first class as a master, and an enslaved man had played his role as a servant to better subvert it. Part 8. Hotels, steamboats, and white-only salons. Charleston, Wilmington, then the North Savannah, at the close of 1848, was an active port, a gateway to the Atlantic and to a dense network of trade relations between the slaveholding South, the industrial North, and foreign markets. Port registers enumerated the arrivals and departures of steamboats, cargoes, and captains' names. They sometimes noted the approximate number of passengers, without dwelling on their status. For authorities, the priority was to monitor the flow of goods, ensuring the smooth functioning of cotton, ice, and tobacco exports. The bodies of enslaved people in these documents appeared en masse as labor, more rarely as travelers. Against this administrative backdrop, the arrival of a sick gentleman accompanied by his black servant did not, in itself, arouse particular attention. Steamboat company employees were accustomed to seeing masters disembark from trains with one or more domestics, head to ticket counters, and purchase passages for Charleston, Wilmington, or other ports. Hotels bordering the streets near the docks also welcomed this type of clientele. They had written one implicit rules: rooms were for white guests. Domestics slept in service areas, in the attic, basement, or sometimes on the floor of narrow corridors. Ellen, still encased in the role as the ailing master, had to cross these white-only thresholds with the same blend of caution and determination as on the train. In a hotel lobby, she approached the reception, perhaps leaning on a cane, perhaps walking with a stiffness that suggested pain. The staff, upon seeing her, instinctively activated the codes of respect due to a client of her presumed condition. They spoke deferentially, offered an upstairs room, and took charge of the luggage. William, relegated to the rank of servant, followed, carrying the trunks, answering practical questions. Hotel registers, when preserved, recorded the name under which the faux master presented himself, a date, a room number. Sometimes a note indicated, accompanied by a domestic. In these lines, Ellen again existed under an identity not her own, shielded by the prestige this invented name inspired. The document knew not that it was inscribing, in carefully traced letters, the mark of a deception that defied the racial code. For it was merely another entry in a client list. In lived reality, the situation was extremely fragile. Within the hotel, in the corridors, in the lounges where meals or drinks were served, Ellen was exposed to more prolonged contact than in a train carriage. Table neighbors might strike up conversation, employees might offer services, curious travelers might inquire about her health. Every sentence was a risk. Her voice had to remain low, her replies brief. Her feigned illness became a constant alibi. She claimed to be too weak to speak at length, too unwell to participate in exchanges. William, relegated to the background, found himself at the crossroads of several constraints. Officially, he was not to appear too close to his master, nor share his comfortable space. In practice, he had to remain sufficiently within sight to intervene if needed, anticipate a dangerous situation, or deflect an indiscretion. In the kitchens, in the service corridors, among other domestics, he overheard fragments of conversations about ships, departures, and inspections. He had to sift through this information, verifying that nothing in the procedures had changed from what he had imagined. Port archives, too, spoke a cold language. They recorded passenger embarkation, sometimes by category. They noted the ship's name, its destination, the departure time. White passengers were, at best, recorded by name. Domestics, however, often disappeared behind generic terms. In this arrangement, Ellen was, once again, protected by her costume. It was her fictitious name that evaded scrutiny. It was that name they inscribed. It was around it that attention was organized. William, like all black servants, was merely an element of context, tolerated, presumed loyal. Aboard the steamboats that hugged the coast toward Charleston, then Wilmington, segregation continued even more distinctly. Cabins, lounges, and decks were segmented not only by price paid, but by color. White passengers of good society enjoyed comfortable spaces, meals served at fixed times, and amenities for eating. Enslaved people and domestics, conversely, circulated in service areas, slept in cramped beds, or even on deck, according to company rules and the officer's discretion. Ellen physically inhabited, for the first time, these forbidden spaces. She slept in a cabin, perhaps alone, perhaps adjacent to other white passengers. The sound of the sea, of the engines, partially masked other sounds, but did not ease the risk. A door suddenly opening, a crew member entering without knocking, a passenger mistaking their cabin, any of these could jeopardize the disguise. At night, the boundary between the mask and the real body became more difficult to maintain. She had to sleep, prepared to sit up, to cover herself, to readjust bandages and scarves. In the white-only lounges, the days of navigation were filled with conversations about politics, commerce, and interstate relations. Perhaps over a meal, they spoke of the increasing tensions with northern abolitionist circles, of rumors of strict laws concerning runaway enslaved people. It is possible that some passengers unknowingly evoked audacious escapes, stories reported in newspapers. Ellen, silent, listened to them. She knew that, if their use failed, she and William would become precisely what they were speaking of: hunted fugitives, stolen property that one would boast of having recovered. In the spaces reserved for domestics, William heard other narratives. Sailors, free or semi-free black employees, enslaved people in transit exchanged information about ports, owners, and risks of capture. Some may have heard of Philadelphia, Boston, of organized black communities. Others repeated what their masters said, that the North was cold, hostile, dangerous for fugitives. William had to listen without confiding, without revealing what was at stake for him in this journey. His prudence was all the more necessary, as the reward promised for a runaway slave could tempt many a precarious man. At each docking, at each city, a new layer of archives overlaid their story. Charleston, with its own port, its own registers, its own hotels, replicated the model already experienced in Savannah. Wilmington, further north, did the same. Each time, Ellen and William had to replay the same scene. Presentation at the counter, check-in at a hotel, boarding another vessel or train. Each time, the official version repeated itself. A sick proprietor traveling for health reasons, a faithful servant in his employ. Administrative documents depicted these movements as a neutral continuity. For them, moving from Savannah to Charleston, then to Wilmington, was simply advancing along a coastline where the trade of cotton and enslaved people flourished. For Ellen and William, it was crossing, step by step, a narrow corridor where each door passed could close behind them. They were constantly on the edge of a space that would normally be entirely closed to them, and only navigated it by borrowing the outward signs of those who oppressed them. This paradox imparted a particular moral charge to this sequence. The use did not consist of leaving the structure, but of traversing it entirely. Ellen and William did not flee by side paths, but at the very heat of the circuits reserved for the white elite. Hotels, salons, first-class cabins, every polite gesture directed at the foe master, every concern for his supposed health, every precaution for his comfort, were so many reminders of the fundamental injustice that made this use necessary. The further north the couple traveled, the more complex the legal framework became. Some ports they passed through remained in slave states. Others approached without yet offering the full and complete security of free soil. The legal risk transformed, but it did not disappear. Federal law, even before the adoption of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, already granted masters extensive rights to reclaim their enslaved people. A fugitive was never simply a clandestine traveler. In the eyes of the law, he was a runaway object that could be claimed. Though the connections, the hotel nights, the white-only salons, Ellen and William learned to gauge this danger. They understood that freedom would not be found in a mere change of scenery, but in crossing a clear legal boundary. As long as they remained in the South, they advanced on a thin line of fragile tolerance. They depended on the ignorance of employees, the routine of inspectors, the power of prejudices that prevented them from being truly examined. As they approached the northern states, the tension transformed without easing. On one hand, hope grew. A few more days, a few more inspections, and they could find themselves in a space where slavery had no sway. On the other hand, the crossing points between South and North were precisely where controls tightened. Authorities knew that these dividing lines attracted fugitives. Companies, anxious to comply with laws on both sides, sometimes multiplied precautions. Charleston, Wilmington. Then the subsequent cities were not just names on a map. They were successive layers of danger, procedures, and papers. At each stage, Ellen and William's official file remained unchanged in the Georgia plantations. They were reported absent soon as fugitives. At each stage, too, their lived reality moved a little further from what these papers described. They were physically present in places where no one would imagine finding two enslaved fugitives. By the time they left the last of these port cities to venture further north, their use had already held longer than the most reasonable prudence would have predicted. They had slept in beds reserved for white people, eaten at tables where the law would have allowed them only to serve, travelled in lounges where their presence, undisguised, would have been deemed intolerable. Yet no alarm had yet sounded, no telegram had yet reported their capture. But the road to freedom passed through a final, narrow, even more dangerous bottleneck. The border towns, where southern trains met northern ones, where inspections concentrated, where rules concerning enslaved people in transit were applied with great rigor. Baltimore, in particular, loomed as a decisive lock. There, papers might not suffice. There, the law sometimes demanded precisely what the disguise could not provide: written proof of ownership, a signature that the faux master could not give. It was at this precise point that their entire edifice could collapse, transforming into a trap what until then had allowed them to advance. Part 9, December 24, 1848. Baltimore, the inspection that could topple everything. On December 24, 1848, Baltimore was not yet, for Ellen and William, a city. It was first and foremost a word laden with ominous rumors. In hushed conversations in the South, this name evoked that of a dangerous passage, a railway hub where rules tightened for those traveling with enslaved people. Companies, subject to competing pressures, more rigorously enforced a requirement simple in its wording and terrible in its consequences. No master should travel further north with an enslaved person without providing written proof of ownership. On the company's papers, this December 24th was a day of high activity. Trains arrived from the south, departed for Philadelphia, New York, other cities. Schedules printed in newspapers, boards displayed in stations, indicated times, platforms, connections. Employees knew that many travelers wished to spend Christmas elsewhere, that delays would be poorly tolerated. The official priority was traffic fluidity, departure regularity. In these schedules, there was no place for the fear of a disguised woman or the short breath of a man who knew everything could collapse in minutes. The train from the south pulled into the station. Ellen, still dressed as a sick master, descended cautiously, William at her side, carrying the luggage. Until now, their official story had held. They had presented themselves as a southern property owner traveling with a single servant en route north. At each stage, the alliance of costume, feigned illness, and racial prejudice had sufficed to protect them. But in Baltimore, the usual mechanism jammed. In the company's offices, an instruction circulated: any passenger presenting to continue further north with an enslaved person must produce conforming papers. The logic, in the eyes of officials, was clear. It was about protecting companies against any accusation of complicity in the escape of enslaved people, assuring Southern owners about the security of their investments, and avoiding costly legal disputes. The rule transformed an ordinary journey into a procedure. It demanded signatures, certificates, proofs. For a genuine master, this additional formality might be annoying, but it remained manageable. He simply needed, in principle, to present a document attesting his right to transport the enslaved person, sometimes to provide testimony, to sign a declaration. For Ellen and William, this requirement was a perfect trap. Ellen possessed no papers attesting that she owned William. In truth, the law continued to consider him himself as someone else's property, and above all, she could not write her name. When an employee announced that they needed to go to an office to have the journey to Philadelphia approved, the couple's hearts sank. The scene, as they would later describe it, unfolded in a space both public and confined, a room where masters, accompanied by their enslaved people, were brought, where a company representative, sometimes assisted by a state official, verified titles of ownership. On the table, forms were laid out, pens, inkwells, the usual decor of administrative procedures transformed, for them, into an instrument of threat. Ellen, in her role, had to enter first. She was seated, spoken to with the deference due to a client of her presumed condition. She was explained, perhaps with apologies, that it was now necessary to sign a document confirming her right to transport this enslaved person north. The official, accustomed to this type of formality proceeding without resistance, extended the pen, indicating where to affix a signature. This was the exact moment when the fiction shattered. In her body, Ellen felt panic surface. If she took the pen and did not know what to do, if her hand betrayed the ignorance in which slavery had kept her, doubt would set in. If she flatly refused, if she protested too loudly, anger and suspicion would awaken. All her disguise, everything that had worked until then, collided with this precise demand to prove through writing what she could not legally be. The official version in the company's documents did not report this turmoil. It merely recorded, no doubt, that a certain reluctant, suffering passenger hesitated to sign, invoked his illness. It was here that an element neither Ellen nor William could foresee, yet which proved decisive, intervened: the intervention of white travelers. In their accounts, they mentioned the attitude of certain passengers who, convinced of the respectability of the ailing master, came to his defense. One can imagine the scene thus: seeing Ellen falter, feigning weakness, perhaps raising her hand to her bandaged arm, a white traveler stepped forward, addressing the employee. He protested against the harshness of the procedure, against the lack of consideration shown to a suffering gentleman. Another chimed in. They urged not to further delay the train for such a trifle, to trust the word of a man clearly of good standing. What saved Ellen at that instant was not only her disguise, but the spontaneous solidarity of white men concerned with defending what they believed to be the honor of their class. Here, the moral tension was particularly acute. These white passengers were not abolitionists. They did not seek to challenge slavery. They acted in the name of a conception of white respectability that excluded the very idea that a master could be humiliated by being suspected of fraud. Their indignation bore not on William's fate, nor on the injustice of the institution, but on what they perceived as bureaucratic excess. Yet their protests served, despite themselves, the cause of two runaway enslaved people. The employee, caught between the zeal of the rule and the pressure of these influential travelers, eventually yielded. He retreated, modified the interpretation of the procedure, agreed to settle for a mark, a minimal sign, or even refrained from demanding a full signature. The force of habit prevailed. It was assumed that a person dressed like Ellen, accompanied by a black servant, could be nothing other than what they claimed. The real possibilities of deception were not entertained. The fiction, for a moment threatened, closed in on itself, and became reality again in the eyes of the institution. In the company's archives, if a form was filled that day, it bore no indication of this tension. At best, one would see an awkward signature, an initial, a trace that in no way reflected the turmoil felt by those who sketched or avoided it. The coldness of the paper contrasted with the intensity of what played out in a few minutes, the possibility for Ellen and William to continue their journey. For them, this moment left a deep imprint. The fear felt within those four walls, facing the extended pen, facing the observing faces, revealed with brutal clarity the nature of the system they were fleeing. Slavery was not only made of blows, chains, fields, it was also made of offices, signatures, forms, meticulous procedures. The law that pursued them was a law of ink and paper as much as a law of whip and gun. On Christmas Eve, in Baltimore Station, the general atmosphere was imbued with a different tone. Church bells pealed to chime. Families gathered. Sermons would be delivered on peace, charity, the birth of a child in a stable. In the newspapers that day, one might find pious articles, calls to prayer, edifying narratives. Nothing in these discourses evoked the fear of a fleeing black couple, confined in an office, praying in silence that the pen would not become a weapon against them. When the decision was finally made to let them board the train for Philadelphia, the episode seemed, to the employees, to conclude with a simple sigh of administrative relief. The incident was over. Departure could be maintained. Service would not be disrupted. For Ellen and William, it was a fragile reprieve. They knew that if the company had yielded this time, it would not necessarily be the case elsewhere. They also knew that their disguise had just been tested at the highest level of tension and had held, but barely. On December 24, 1848, in Baltimore, Ellen and William's official file in the Georgia plantations may have begun to accumulate new documents. Anxious masters, seeing no return, might have begun inquiries, questioned neighbors, suspected escape. Soon, runaway advertisements would appear, letters would depart for other states, requests for assistance would be formulated. The slave system would awaken, realizing that two of its properties had escaped its control. But at the precise moment the train departed for Philadelphia, all of this was still nascent. Ellen and William were still, physically, ahead of the narrative their former masters would begin to write about them. They were, for a few more hours, fugitives whose pursuit had not officially begun. Baltimore Station, with its office, its forms, its rules, could have detained them, delivered them, transformed their audacity into tragedy. It ultimately let them pass, largely because a group of white men refused to conceive that a master could be anything other than what his appearance indicated. In the cold light of that December 24th, on Christmas Eve, the system's violence revealed itself in a particular guise, that of a supposedly neutral administrative equipment designed not to protect the weak, but to secure property. Ellen and William escaped, once again, by turning its own certainties against this system. Their train was now heading for Pennsylvania, where the law did not admit slavery, but the legal frontier awaiting them did not, as if by magic, ease the accumulated risks. It transformed their status on paper. It did not yet deliver their bodies from fear. Yet it was there, in that beginning Christmas night, that the concrete possibility of entering a free city finally opened. Part 10, December 25th, 1848. Philadelphia. Entry into a free city. On December 25th, 1848, in Philadelphia, newspapers spoke of Christmas. They published religious meditations, announcements of services, accounts of charity towards the poor. In more sober columns, one also found commercial news, information on arrived cargoes, on trains that had pulled into the station that morning. Nothing, at first glance, indicated that a couple of runaway enslaved people had just crossed the Pennsylvania border after a journey of nearly 1,000 miles. For the city, that day, the train was one among many, the crowd of travelers an anonymous mass. For Ellen and William, this moment was anything but trivial. In leaving Baltimore and entering Pennsylvania, they had traversed an invisible yet decisive legal line. In this state, slavery was not recognized. Pennsylvania law did not consider that a master could legitimately exercise property power over a person there. Yet, federal law still hovered over their heads. In the eyes of Washington and federal courts, they remained fugitives who could, in theory, be claimed and returned to Georgia. This ambiguity translated, in their bodies, into a contradictory sensation, relief and vertigo. When the train slowed on its approach to Philadelphia, the meticulously maintained staging from Macon had to be upheld for a few moments longer. Ellen was still, to the eyes that met hers, a sick white man, a gentleman weary from travel. William was still a black servant carrying luggage. They disembarked onto the platform as they had boarded in Macon, each in a role that corresponded neither to their real identity nor to their legal status. But the ground they now trod had changed. This detail, unknown to other travelers, transformed for them the meaning of every step. Philadelphia's railway archives, if consulted, spoke of this arrival with the same neutrality as everywhere else. A train from the south entered the station at such and such a time. Passengers disembarked, others continued their journey. Agents checked tickets, helped unload luggage. The city, in its official documents, remained deaf to the quiet miracle unfolding amidst this familiar scene. Two enslaved people from the southern bank of a border had just set foot in a free state. Very quickly, however, this abstract passage in legal language translated for Ellen and William into an urgent question: where to go now? The disguise that had protected them throughout the journey became, as legal security increased, a burdensome shell they yearned to shed. But they could not, however, reveal themselves on the platform amidst the crowd. The presence of slave catchers, bribed agents, informers, was never to be ruled out. Caution remained necessary for a few more hours. It was here that another type of network intervened, less visible in official archives, yet very real. That of abolitionists, aid societies, organized black communities. Philadelphia, in 1848, hosted a significant free black population, churches, associations, activists who, for years, had assisted fugitives from the South. In his notebooks, a man like William Still would note, over time, the names, faces, and itineraries of those who arrived thus, exhausted, in a city not necessarily welcoming, but which at least offered a beach in the slave code. According to late accounts, Ellen and William were quickly taken in by abolitionists. Perhaps they had been provided, before their departure, with a letter recommending their case to a contact in Philadelphia. Perhaps it was a free black man at the station who, accustomed to spotting the hesitant silhouettes of fugitives, understood their distress and guided them. In any case, they left the anonymous space of the station to enter another type of place, a discreet house, a room adjacent to a church, an association office. Modest spaces, often ignored by newspapers, but essential in the chain of rescue. There, behind a closed door, the disguise could finally fall. One imagines this simple moment as a scene of almost unbearable intensity. Ellen undoing, one by one, the bandages, the scarves, the buttons of the coat, removing the hat, the spectacles. For the first time in days, she stood before faces that looked at her for what she was, an exhausted young black woman, no longer a fictitious white master. The contrast between this real body and the image she had to inhabit to survive summarized, in an instant, the cruel absurdity of the racial code they had just defied. Abolitionist archives, when they exist, sometimes preserve traces of this type of encounter. A register might note, a couple arrived from Georgia by train at Christmas 1848. The woman, very light-skinned, had traveled disguised as a white man, the husband as her servant. These sober lines, fixed on paper, a reality that Southern authorities would deem scandalous. Enslaved people had used the codes of white respectability to escape. Abolitionists, for their part, saw in it proof of the ingenuity, courage, and will for freedom of those whom the law persisted in calling property. In the office of an anti-slavery society, one can imagine the following scene. On a table, sheets, pens, inkwells, similar to those that in Baltimore threatened to betray Ellen. This time, another type of writing was put to use. Their names, their origin, the stages of their escape were noted. They were asked what they knew of their former masters, the conditions in which they lived, not to return them, but to document the abuses, to fuel arguments, to provide concrete examples to those who, in the North and in England, campaigned against slavery. The office became a place of memory, no longer a machine for control. The tension, however, did not dissipate at once. Pennsylvania was a free state, but it was not an absolute sanctuary. Slave catchers could operate there under certain conditions, relying on federal law, tacit agreements, complicities. Racist prejudices persisted. Philadelphia had convinced abolitionists, but also indifferent, even hostile citizens who regarded the arrival of fugitives from the South as a problem, a source of tension. For Ellen and William, the city was both refuge and danger zone. On the night of this Christmas 1848, the city's religious atmosphere offered a striking contrast to the reality of their situation. In churches, they sang of the birth of a poor child, spoke of welcome, of redemption. In homes, families gathered around laden tables, exchanged gifts. A few streets away, in a discreet room, two people tried to sleep for the first time on free soil, yet without feeling safe. They knew that if their former masters learned of their escape, they would not hesitate to mobilize the law to try to reclaim them. For Ellen, this first night without the costume could be an occasion for a brutal return to her own body. For days she had lived in the skin of a sick white man, wearing a coat too heavy, a bandage that constrained her, a posture that was not her own. She had spoken as little as possible, breathed too softly, controlled every gesture. Now that the role was suspended, fatigue set in, but freedom was not a clear-cut feeling. It mingled with a form of disbelief, of residual fear. Georgia law continued to exist, and with it, on paper, a man's claim to still own her. William, for his part, discovered another type of burden. Until now, his role had been that of a silent protector, a seemingly submissive servant, but always on alert, ready to intervene. In Philadelphia, in this city where free black men circulated, worked, organized associations, he glimpsed the possibility of building a life that would no longer be entirely dictated by a master's will. But this possibility was accompanied by a new responsibility. What to do with this relative freedom? Where to go next? Stay in Philadelphia, where the proximity of the South and slave catchers constituted a danger, or go further north, to Boston, to England? Documents from abolitionist societies often indicated a recurring pattern. Fugitives arriving in Philadelphia were not encouraged to settle there permanently. They were helped with temporary lodging, provided with clothes, food, and advice. Then they were sent, if possible, to cities further from the South, where the pressure from slave masters and their agents was less direct. Ellen and William would be no exception to this logic. Their passage through Philadelphia, however decisive, was but a stage. On the table where their presence was recorded, the lines written that day would, much later, become archival pieces. They would join files, publications, studies. They would help to date, authenticate, and contextualize this Christmas 1848 escape. But as the ink dried, neither Ellen nor William yet knew what place their story would occupy in collective memory. They knew only that they had survived the journey, that they had managed to use, against it, a system that held them as mere things. On December 25, 1848, Philadelphia did not stop for them. The city breathed, worked, prayed, celebrated. Most of its inhabitants would know nothing of this couple who had arrived discreetly, aided by networks unknown to them. Yet, this day, for the history of slavery represented a turning point. It showed that the lines drawn by law could be crossed by those they claimed to imprison, provided they understood, with painful precision, how the code that oppressed them functioned. In the silence of a room that night, Ellen and William could finally utter words they had not dared to formulate since their departure. "We are out of Georgia, out of the train cars, out of the role of docile property." But they had not yet reached the end of their path. Soon, other laws, other forms, other threats would remind them of the harshness of the world they inhabited. For now, this Christmas 1848, inscribed in a few abolitionist notes and in the memories they would cherish throughout their lives, remained as the day when, for the first time, they breathed together in a city where, on paper at least, no master had the right to own them. Part 11. From an Escape to a State File. Boston, the Law of 1850, and the official Hunt Boston, at the turn of the 1850 Niendai, presented itself in official reports as a city of commerce, culture, and religion. Municipal statistics listed the number of schools, libraries, and learned societies. Bourgeois newspapers prided themselves on its role in the American Revolution, its traditions of liberty, its culture of debate. On paper, it was a city that liked to see itself as a moral beacon of the North. Yet, behind this image, another reality was inscribed in the archives, that of a city caught in the contradictions of a country that still tolerated and protected slavery. After their passage through Philadelphia, Ellen and William made their way to this city, which, viewed from Georgia, seemed to embody a promise of security. Boston possessed influential abolitionist circles, committed churches, and newspapers like William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator, which relentlessly denounced slavery. For a fugitive, reaching it meant, ostensibly, arriving in a place where sympathy was probable and aid was organized. But federal papers told another story. Boston was also a battleground between a militant populace and a government determined to uphold the rights of slave owners throughout the territory. In the first years following their escape, Ellen and William found in Boston a space to breathe and to speak. They discovered a world where free black people and businesses thrived, where public meetings were organized to raise funds for fugitives. They were invited to testify, to recount their journey, to explain before white and black assemblies what slavery in Georgia concretely entailed. These gatherings took place in modest but crowded halls, churches, and meeting rooms. Reports appeared in the abolitionist press, summarizing their words, quoting them, sometimes subtly transforming them to serve the cause. In these texts, Ellen's figure took on an almost symbolic dimension. Emphasis was placed on the audacious nature of her disguise, on the irony of a society compelled to recognize, for a few days, a black woman as a white master. The episodes at Baltimore Station, the hotels, the steamboats, were recounted with a precision that owed as much to the needs of propaganda as to the memories themselves. These narratives served to denounce the absurdity of racial hierarchy, to show that its codes could be turned against it. They made Ellen and William privileged witnesses in awareness campaigns. However, as they became public figures, their vulnerability grew. What abolitionists brought to light soon also attracted the attention of their former masters. In the private correspondence of Georgia slaveholders, indignant mentions began to appear from 1849 onwards, concerning this couple who had not only stolen their own person, but now dared to speak publicly, challenging those who still claimed them as property. The masters complained, wrote to lawyers, and pondered the legal means offered to recover what they considered their possessions. It is here that the intimate story of an escape met a broader political movement. In 1850, as part of a compromise designed to appease tensions between slave states and free states, the federal government adopted a new law on fugitive enslaved people, the Fugitive Slave Act. This text, as it appeared in legal collections, considerably strengthened the powers of masters and their agents. It compelled authorities in free states to actively cooperate in the capture and return of fugitives, stipulated fines for anyone who aided them, and created federal commissions specifically tasked with these matters. In the impersonal prose of this law, Ellen and William's names did not appear. The text spoke only of persons held to service or labor in one state who had escaped to another. But, in practice, concrete cases would illustrate and test this new legal regime. The Crafts case was one of them. Their former owners, informed of the fugitives' presence in Boston, decided to employ the means offered by the law. They dispatched agents, sometimes called slave catchers, armed with legal documents, to travel north and bring them back. In Boston, this situation was not entirely unexpected. Abolitionist activists, committed pastors, members of the Boston Vigilance Committee, an organization formed to protect fugitives, had anticipated that the 1850 law would transform their city into a battlefield. In their minutes, in their letters, one reads of the preparation of strategies, warning fugitives as soon as a rumor of a hunt arrived, organizing surveillance, providing hiding places, mobilizing lawyers to contest procedures. The archives of these committees reveal a discreet but determined network, ready to stand against the application of federal law on their soil. When the agents sent from Georgia arrived in Boston to reclaim Ellen and William, the city entered a state of tension. Officially, these men were merely representatives of the law, coming to assert a right recognized by Congress and the President. They presented themselves, papers in hand, to local authorities, requested their assistance, and expected to find obedient officials. But they encountered an environment where a significant portion of the population morally refused what was being asked of them. In the newspapers of the time, the Crafts case became a commented on, debated affair. The pro-freedom press, or simply the legalistic one, insisted on the sacred nature of property rights, on the necessity for an orderly county to enforce its laws everywhere within its territory. It accused abolitionists of anarchy, religious fanaticism, and undermining the Union. Abolitionist newspapers, for their part, presented Ellen and William as victims of unjust persecution, recalled the details of their lives as enslaved people, published petitions and resolutions from assemblies, declaring Boston's solidarity with fugitives. The house where the couple resided transformed into a monitored location. Members of the Boston Vigilance Committee stood guard. Neighbors were alerted. Signals were agreed upon in case of an alarm. Meetings were held with lawyers, pastors, and activists. In the notes taken at the time, a strategy emerged: to buy time, exert public pressure, and make authorities understand that the Crafts arrest would provoke dangerous unrest. Federal law was against them. The opinion of a part of the city was in their favor. At the federal level, the case reached President Millard Fillmore. In the archives of his presidency, one finds texts where he reaffirmed his intention to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act without exception. The official position was clear. Whatever sympathy some might feel for fugitives, respect for the law must prevail. The Crafts affair, among others, became a test of this resolve. Supporters of the Compromise of 1850 feared that if a concession were made in such a visible case, the entire edifice laboriously constructed to maintain peace between North and South would crumble. For Ellen and William, these political considerations translated into a feeling of being trapped. They were no longer merely former enslaved people who had made an audacious escape. They had become, against their will, symbols. Their presence in Boston crystallized a conflict of principles between two conceptions of law and justice. In their daily lives, this meant they could no longer move without caution, that they had to contemplate the possibility of a hasty departure, that they could no longer rely on mere geographical distance from Georgia to protect them. The solution that then emerged was not within the borders of the United States, but across the Atlantic. In abolitionist circles, the possibility was raised for particularly exposed fugitives to leave the country for Great Britain, where slavery had been abolished and where American law did not apply. Fundraising campaigns, transatlantic networks, and contacts with British anti-slavery societies made this project real. For Ellen and William, it appeared as the only way to escape a legal entanglement that eventually reached even the most militant cities of the North. The letters exchanged at that time, the announcements of assemblies, the committee notes bore the mark of a dual tone. The determination to resist the law and the awareness that this resistance had limits within a national framework where the federal state held the final word. Sending the Crufts to England was not abandoning their defense. It was shifting the ground of their security to a space where no injunction signed in Washington could demand their return. The boat tickets, this time, were no longer instruments of a hidden use, but the visible pieces of a conscious decision. When Ellen and William embarked, in 1850, for London, their departure was surrounded by a body of writings that contrasted with the silence of their initial escape. Meetings had been held to finance the journey. Newspaper articles announced or commented on their departure. Letters of recommendation had been drafted for them to introduce them to British abolitionist societies. The transatlantic crossing was no longer undertaken in the secrecy of a disguise, but under the gaze of a network that had decided to remove them, as much as possible, from the reach of American law. The transformation of their escape into a state affair became clear when one traced the trajectory of their names in the archives. Initially discreet, downed in Georgia's inventories, they then moved into the minutes of anti-slavery societies, into the columns of the militant press, into the correspondence of indignant masters, into the reports of federal committees. Each new record added a layer to this file. What began as a couple's act of survival became a matter mobilizing ministers, presidents, associations, and public opinions on both sides of the ocean. The moral tension of this part of their story lay in this disposition. Ellen and William had never sought to become symbols. They had sought to save their lives, their marriage, their chance not to see their potential children born into captivity. It was the system, though its rigidity, its pretense of controlling bodies across thousands of miles, its inability to tolerate the slightest breach, that propelled them to the center of a national political conflict. Their existence became a kind of mirror in which the country was forced to confront itself. What was the value of a law that demanded the return of a woman who had escaped servitude to those who claimed her as property? In Boston, once they had left American soil, the case never truly closed. Debates continued. Newspapers kept mentioning their case as an example. Abolitionists cited their escape and exile to denounce the brutality of the Fugitive Slave Act. Authorities, for their part, strove to show that they would continue, despite this episode, to apply the law without weakness. In this intertwining of discourses, one thing remained invisible. Ellen and William, whom they had sought to reduce to entries in an inventory, had crossed a second time a decisive frontier. After leaving Georgia for Pennsylvania, they left the United States for a country where, officially, no master could brandish a paper to reclaim them. This passage paved the way for another phase of their lives, filled with lectures, writing, and self-reconstruction outside the territory that had enslaved them. But it left a lasting trace in American archives, a file where laws, circulars, editorials, petitions, reports mingled, all born from the refusal of two individuals to accept the destiny the slave code had assigned them. It is from this heterogeneous material that later one can reconstruct, piece by piece, not only their story, but also the extent of the legal machine that was set in motion to try to reclaim them. Part 12. The Grand Disguise in the Archives: Memory, Erasures, and Legacy. When Ellen and William Craft published Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom in London in 1860, they did more than simply recount an escape. They produced a document that voluntarily added itself to the existing mass of archives on slavery, where the registers of Macon, the bills of sale, the newspaper advertisements had inscribed only first names, prices, colors. This book offered a counter-record, dates, places, scenes, voices. On a reader's table, in England or the United States, one could now place side by side a runaway fugitive notice and the written account of that very property, explaining how she had escaped. This act of writing, however, had its limits. The text was signed by two names, but the pen was primarily William's. Ellen's voice traversed the narrative, but filtered, reported. She rarely spoke in the first person. Her thoughts were often constructed through her husband's gaze. In the editorial logic of the 19th century, it was more readily accepted that a black man publish a testimony than that a black woman speak in her own name. The book, which corrected so many silences, perpetuated another, that of Ellen's direct voice, which reached us as a slightly muffled sound through the pages. For a time, however, this text circulated and resonated. It was read in abolitionist circles, cited in lectures, used as proof of the violence and contradictions of American slavery. Copies preserved today sometimes bear traces of this militant use. Marginal annotations, underlined passages, handwritten dates. Alongside the official literature defending the slave code, this book opened a parallel file, fragile yet tenacious, where the victim's version was printed in black characters, difficult to erase. In the South, in the years following the Civil War, other types of writings proliferated. Reconstruction ordinances, labor contracts, marriage certificates of formerly enslaved people, testimonies before commissions. A portion of these documents rapidly disappeared, swept away by the chaos of defeat, by fires, by negligence, by the deliberate desire to obliterate a certain past. Registers were burned, local archives poorly preserved, private correspondence destroyed. The record of slavery at the level of plantations, cities, and families was riddled with intentional gaps. Within these lacunae, the craft's trajectory blunted for a long time. It is known that they returned to the United States, settled for a time in Georgia after the war, and attempted to live on purchased land, in a world where formal freedom did not end violence, pressures, and discrimination. But written traces of these years are rare. A few notices, a few letters, mentions in newspapers, scattered administrative papers. Nothing as structured as the bills of sale from their years of enslavement. Documentation is sparse when the system officially ceased to consider them as property. In the 20th century, another form of oblivion settled. In school textbooks, in broad historical syntheses, slavery was often discussed in blocks, statistics, dates of laws, major political debates. A few figures emerged, mostly male, sometimes transformed into reassuring symbols of linear progress. The detailed account of an escape like Ellen and William's partly vanished from the public horizon. Their names persisted in specialized bibliographies in a few scholarly works, but they did not occupy the center of the national narrative. Again, a form of silence enveloped the details of that Christmas 1848. Yet, the archives were not dead. They merely slumbered. In a repository, a yellowed copy of Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom awaited a historian, a student, a filmmaker to open it. In a reading room, a microfilm of a Macon newspaper from 1849 waited for a gaze to fall upon a small advertisement reporting the escape of an enslaved couple described as very light-skinned. In boxes, master's correspondence, notes from the Boston Vigilance Committee, reports from federal commissions mentioned, sometimes briefly, the Kraft case. The file was never completely closed. It had merely remained forgotten on a shelf for a long time. At the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries, new research focused on these dispersed traces. Works of microhistory, genealogical inquiries, studies on mixed-race families in the South brought to light possible connections, lineages, proximities between Ellen and other lines marked by the same blend of blood and original violence. Digitization projects made accessible online sets of documents formerly reserved for a few specialists: runaway notices, survey registers, court minutes, abolitionist archives. These tools did not fill all silences, but they allowed for the fragmented reconstruction of a life that had been partially erased. In these new files, Ellen was no longer merely a secondary figure in her husband's narrative. She appeared as the center of a reflection on whiteness, gender, and social performance. Studies emphasized that it was her body, precisely marked by sexual violence and the hypocrisy of masters, that made the disguise possible. Others pondered how she had psychologically experienced this role reversal, presenting herself, for days, as the visible embodiment of the class that had destroyed her. The Great Christmas Disguise ceased to be a spectacular anecdote. It became a key to analyzing the system as a whole. Yet even these works, these films, documentaries, and recent books must contend with an obstinate reality. The majority of slavery's victims never left a comparable account. They did not write books, were not invited to speak at conferences, did not see their names preserved in abolitionist correspondence. They appeared, at best, as shadows in the archives, a first name in an advertisement, a body valued on an inventory list, a mention in a police report. Behind the relative clarity of the Kraft file, there are thousands of phantom files, never reconstructed, never told. Today, in an archive room or behind a computer screen, one can reconstruct, document by document, Ellen and William's itinerary. Macon, Savannah, Charleston, Wilmington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, Boston, London. One can almost follow, on a map, the path of the railways, the sea routes, the legal borders they crossed. But this reconstruction, however intellectually satisfying, must not obscure what it cannot do: restore the exact texture of their fears, their silences, the nights when they wondered if tomorrow would still be granted to them. The archive is a light, but it is also a mask. Looking at this file, placing it today on a real or virtual table, another question arises. What, in our own laws, in our own forms, in our own files, prepares the injustices that will perhaps later be called unimaginable? The papers, the signatures, the certificates that, in 1848, controlled the bodies of Ellen and William, have contemporary equivalents: visas, permits, databases, border surveillance systems. Other lives, in other contexts, are being played out today in offices where documents are stamped with the same assurance as the employees in Baltimore on Christmas Eve. The memory of Ellen and William Kraft, if taken seriously, compels us to maintain this tension, to honor their courage, to acknowledge the singularity of their use, but to refuse to close their story with a simple narrative of victory. Their disguise worked because an entire system refused to imagine that those it dehumanized could think, calculate, observe, and disguise themselves in turn. This same inability to imagine the victim's perspective still exists in other forms, in other institutions. At the end of this journey, there remains on the table a worn book, a few copies of newspaper advertisements, excerpts of laws, committee reports, historians' notes. There also remains, in the silence of what was not written, innumerable lives that will never have a documentary, never a biography. To think of Ellen and William is not only to admire a spectacular escape, it is to accept seeing, behind their faces, the multitude of others who remained anonymous, who did not find the flaw or could not attempt it. So, in this final silence, a question lingers, without definitive answer, like a missing piece in the file. What do we do today with these archives we inherit, and those we, in turn, produce? Will they serve, for future generations, to understand how some lives were protected and others broken? Or will they become, like so many burned registries of yesterday, the support for an organized oblivion,